It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Spencer Klavan, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith. Spencer, it's always a joy to speak with you. Welcome back to the show.
Shaun, it's so great to see you again. Thanks for having me.
Truly my pleasure. It's been, gosh, maybe a year and a half ish since you were last on the show. So I'm going
That's
to go
right.
back to my tried and true icebreaker of let's have you share a little bit of the Spencer Klavan origin story, just given like the work you do, the space you write in. You're a little bit off the beaten path from my average author who writes in the Christian publishing space. So give us a little bit of feel for who you are and the work you do.
Yeah, I'm happy to give my villain origin story. Why are you like this? I think is another way of framing this question. And you're right. I have grown up with a bit of an eclectic background. I actually wasn't raised Christian. I found my way to Christianity between the ages of about 14 and 16. I was really raised in a sort of secular modern household. If we had a faith, it was the quote unquote free thinking faith. We were proud that we could just kind of survey. We weren't raised in any particular doctrine or creed, and we didn't go to any particular church. And that was really a point of pride with us. And so it's kind of an amazing fact, and it's a God thing, really, that every one of my family members, myself, my mom, my dad, and my sister, have all become Christians. It was not written in stone. It wasn't a given. And I think that's a big part of the origin story behind this book as well, because this really is a book that's written for high school Spencer. It's written for a smart kid who loves science, wants to know the truth about the world, but also wants to understand answers to the bigger questions that science can't answer. Because I think when I was a kid, I was growing up in like the high noon of the new atheism, guys like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, and even some adjacent figures like Stephen Hawking, who really made the case that like everything there is to know is from science. We know the truth of human origins from evolution. We know the truth of our place in the universe from cosmology, and all that other stuff throughout human history has really just been fantasy and fan fiction storytelling that humans like to tell to make ourselves feel better at night. Um, and I really felt dissatisfied by that as a kid, but I couldn't quite say how or why. Um, and the atmosphere around me was so suffused with this materialism that it took me a long time to think my way out of it. And so this book is essentially a guide route for people like that to think your way out of materialism through pulling the camera back and understanding a little bit more about where those assumptions came from that really dominated in my youth, the assumptions of materialism, the assumptions of the new atheism, and why they've proven to be wrong, not just philosophically, but also scientifically wrong, and why they're falling apart.
And as a publishing guy, I always love it when an author says, I wrote this book to, like you said, to high school Spencer or my
Right.
former self, because I always
Who's
feel
your
like,
audience? Who's it for?
well,
Yeah.
and that's the thing. I feel like anytime we write a book, we're trying to deal with our own crises. We're trying to solve our own problems. And I feel like that's almost the appeal. We write for our former self, and we're changed in the process as we remember what we needed and offer that on to a whole new audience. I'm curious for you in terms of kind of your faith journey. Like how does that coincide? Because I've had your dad on before to talk about his testimony and his faith journey. How does your time of coming to faith like coincide with his? Does it at all? Just like you said, everybody has come to faith. Like, is there a timeline where things cross paths there at all?
That's a great question. And I think about it a lot, actually, because my recollection is that these things were very separate from one another, my journey, my sister's journey, my dad's journey. But of course, they must have been intertwined in ways we didn't even see. In a family as close as ours, there's always going to be overlap. But I think my dad's journey was much longer and slower. In his book, he tells it as a really 10-year process. So it got started before mine did. It ended before mine did. And I think mine kind of began right as he was coming around to the conclusion that he needed to be baptized. Interestingly, he didn't really tell that to us kids. He didn't share that with us. I think he didn't want to bother us, didn't want to make us feel uncertain or unsettled, and he wasn't going to come out, as it were, until it was really clear what he was doing, until he was sure from his own perspective. But I think, if anything, the spark was touched off by two things. One was that my parents started going to church, and they didn't take me. I didn't come with them, but I just to see that and have that model available was a big help. And the other thing, which is a little bit more unorthodox, is my parents' library, which was just a central feature of my childhood, was to grow up surrounded by books of all kinds. And we really weren't given any sort of rules. I mean, it's sort of dangerous to give a 12-year-old an open adult library. I mean, there was nothing like obscene or grotesque on there, but we could pull down Dostoevsky and make whatever sense we could out of it. We could read the comics and on the bottom shelf or whatever. And so I was always surrounded by these friends from all throughout history, all these different books, and that I was given free range over. And so when I started to ask these larger questions, like where did the world come from and what's my purpose in the universe, I instinctively, I think, started to think, well, maybe I can survey the world's literature. And I found on my parents' shelves the things that my dad had been reading to get through these questions. Obviously, the Bible was a huge part of that, and that was something I gravitated toward. But I also looked at the Quran, I read the Bhagavad Gita, I read the Tao Te Ching. I mean, I did a real survey of kind of world literatures, and that was a huge part of my journey to faith, was realizing that whatever I could glean from all these books, religious or secular or whatever, there was one book that distinctively felt like coming home in a way that other books didn't. And it was the character, the kind of God that's described and presented in the Bible that synced up with my own thoughts about what God must be like, how he would be like if he were truly good. And so there was a real sense of recognition in that, which I think ultimately is probably why I ended up a Christian. And definitely does have its origins in my dad's and my mom's life as well, just not in the way that you might think.
And well, I want to pull on another sideways thread for a moment because this just popped into my head. Like, how does this impact your education journey? Like, you're trained in classics, you've taught yourself languages, and just in terms of that kind of coming to faith, just having access to this great library, how does that point your direction in terms of how like where you chose to get educated, the things you studied?
Yeah, well, I never stood a chance when it comes to being a nerd. There was just no other way forward for me. It's a you have these questions about nature and nurture that are eternal, right? Was I born this way, or did I make my way to this because I was raised in a house full of books? And I think the best philosophers always end up with some version of, well, it's a little bit of both, right? Yes, and both of those things are happening at once. I was always a cerebral kid. I'm told that when I was a toddler learning to speak, I shut myself in the bathroom and practiced sentences until I could get them right. That's the kind of kid I was. I don't remember that, but it sounds very, very accurate. And it's definitely something essential about me, is just a real obsession over language and the right words and how language makes us human, which is a major dimension also of this book. And then, yeah, I was just given a wonderful sort of rich ground for that to take shape. I mentioned my obsession with language, which is probably the center of this whole thing. My obsession with words, and actually, it was that obsession that ultimately led me to become a Christian. Specifically, I had this Gideon's Bible, the blue ones that they leave in hotel rooms. And if you've ever opened a Gideon's Bible, the front pages have John 3:16 in them. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. And that sentence is, I believe, still the most widely translated sentence in the world. It's been rendered into innumerable languages. And to make this point, the Gideon's Bible prints the French version and the German version and the Hindi version and over again. And these were languages that I was now studying. Not all of them, obviously, but Romance languages, Latin, Greek. And so I found myself late at night reading through this claim, this statement made in a million different ways with a million different forms and words and grammatical inflections attached to it. And it was through that almost mystical process that I had what I can only describe as kind of transcendent experience, where those small W words fell away and the capital W word, the actual underlying meaning, was like there in the room with me. To see through human language to divine truth actually did bring home the truth of the crucifixion, the resurrection, and salvation to me. And it's something I keep with me all the time, because obviously the background to that is a very nerdy background, and it involves a lot of learning and whatever. But the end of it is something that all Christians everywhere have experienced in some way. That is the presence of God, the crucified Jesus Christ. And to have that direct experience and to realize that all my studying was to lead to that point, really important, because you can get wrapped up in the minutia and how smart you are and how great it is to know all these facts. But at the end of the day, it's all there to serve. It's all there to offer that truth again and to connect directly to the source of all truth. I think Thomas Aquinas, before he died, had a vision and said, "Everything I have written is like so much straw, because it's all just the kind of kindling for this divine fire." And that has been certainly true in my own small way as well, that all my learning is there to get myself and other people kind of again into contact with that truth.
And in terms of your dedication, I was curious why you dedicated the book to your mom, because I've worked with authors exclusively for the last 11 years, and dedications are very personal and often significant and meaningful. So I'm curious, why dedicate this book in particular to your mom?
Well, first of all, my mom is my best editor, and I know that people say that, like, my mom likes my book. Mom does like my books, but she's also an actual professional editor. So I always have to explain to people when I say, oh, I'm working on my new book. I gave it to my mom. She really likes it. Everyone's like, well, yeah, your mom likes it. But no, my mom is an actual editor who will tell me when things are bad and when things are good. And she was involved in this process so patiently from the very beginning. I got the idea for this book sitting in the DMV while I was waiting for my license to be renewed. And this is the only good thing that's ever happened at the DMV, actually, is to me at least, is that I got the idea for this book. And I sent her the rambling kind of free writing scribblings that led to this book. I sent her every chapter in draft form, and she was so generous with her time and thoughtful with her comments. That was the main reason why this book is dedicated to her. I think it was probably inevitable in my career that at some point I would dedicate a book to my mom, because she's the only member of my family that doesn't have a public presence. And either despite that or because of that, she's also the best person in my family by a country mile. She is just a one of those souls that you come into contact with, and everybody who meets her understands that you are in the presence of a really pure and loving soul. And I was very, very lucky to be raised by a person like that. So the dedication comes with a passage from Wordsworth, the Prelude, about how blessed children are by their mothers. And it's actually about the theme of the book, which is the way we see the world and how our experience, our perception of the world shapes the world. And Wordsworth says, "Blessed the infant babe who drinks in from his mother's eye the humanity and the love that we then experience in the rest of the world." When we go out and the way we experience nature, the way we interpret our day-to-day experience, all informed by those first few moments and the messages, subliminal and otherwise, that your parents are sending you. And so not only is my mom a presence in this book through her editing, she's a presence in my life, as everyone's mother must be, even if you never know your mother. That absence also informs the way you experience the world. So I'm just supremely grateful to have the mother that I have, and also it seemed appropriate given what the book is about to kind of acknowledge that influence right at the top.
And, by tradecraft, so to speak, you're not a scientist, you're not a
No.
theologian per se. Like, why were you the right person to write this book? Like, my assumption is just with the different experiences you've had and how well read you are, you're able to look at this from kind of a sideways view that a scientist can't quite see and a theologian can't quite see. So, why was this the right message and for you to put together?
Yeah. So the introduction of this book begins by saying everybody is going to be mad at me for having chosen this subject because, as you say, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a theologian, and this is a book of natural theology, is what you used to call it. That is the interpretation of science as a means of knowing God. And this is a very ancient Christian practice. Psalm 19 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God." There is this idea that the world around us is sacramental. That is, it clothes or expresses God's character to us. And so, on one level, there's nothing strange at all about looking at science and trying to discover attributes of God's majesty. But as you say, there's something a little bit strange or daunting about me doing it, about this little nutnik taking up the call. And one reason why I thought that actually was a positive. I actually that drew me to the project. The fact that by all accounts I shouldn't be writing this book, because as I said before, this is a book for high school Spencer, for young up and coming smart guy who is not a scientist, but who feels that the authority of science has closed off the route to faith. And in many ways, although there is some sort of popular, accessible explanation of scientific fact in the book is less about science than about what science has done to the popular imagination, the way that normal people who aren't scientists experience the weight and the authority of physics, especially as a statement of absolute truth. And so it's important, I think, for somebody to address that who has experienced that, who has been through it. And at the same time, I think it's important for us as lay people to have a certain degree of ownership over our own beliefs. In other words, it's true that, there are people out there who will always know way, way more about science than I do. I will not be the person who resolves the apparent paradoxes between Einstein's relativity and quantum theory. The breakthrough on quantum gravity ain't coming from me. You won't hear about it first from me. All of those things are true. But I think that we have gone so far in that direction that certain interested parties are now able to claim the authority of science in support of claims where science actually has no authority. And religious arguments are a good example of this. You will often hear people like Dawkins say things like, well, Darwin has basically dispensed with the religious account of the origin of humanity. And one thing that I think we need to recover in this age where it actually kind of seems like maybe faith is coming back, is the sense of what science can and cannot pronounce authoritatively on. Science can tell you the answer to how fast COVID will spread in a given situation. Science cannot tell you the answer to how we should react politically to that fact. And in much the same way, science can tell you the scientific method is the best method we have available for answering questions like, what is the composition of this dirt? It's not the best method for saying, why or how do the rules that govern the universe exist at all? And what do they say? And what is their sort of spiritual implication? And so this is a book designed to kind of chart the outlines of that boundary around science, and also to explain the history of, how we got where we are with and it does give, I think, a decent sort of layman's survey of the cutting edge state of quantum physics especially, but also, evolutionary theory and those sorts of things, so that people can have a certain sense that this is not like some alien theological wisdom that can pronounce from on high and they can't say anything about it. We I think need to recover a certain degree of ownership over our own beliefs, even when they intersect with or are related to scientific discoveries.
I just want to make a brief comment in terms of like we see this all throughout culture in terms of somebody who is an influencer on the top of one mountain. They've achieved success and credibility, and they're the name. And then you'll notice
Yeah,
them trying to jump over to the top of another mountain to comment on something else. We see this constantly with politicians and movie stars and all kinds of folks where they're going to tell you who to vote for or how to change your health, whatever it might be. People always try to transfer their credibility on one cultural mountain, usually into another. And if a lot of times, if you think about it, you're like, why would I listen to that person about this, that? Like they have absolutely no expertise. Like especially in the case of like actors, it's like they pretend for a living. Why do we care what they have to say?
100%. Michael Crichton, the guy that wrote Jurassic Park, had a great essay once where he said, everybody opens the newspaper and you get to some article about something you know a lot about. Like for me, let's say it's Greek, somebody's summarizing like the Herculaneum scrolls. And you read the newspaper article and you think, this guy's got no idea. This journalist is like a total airhead. And even what he does know, he has to present in these really dumbed down terms that don't really get it right. And this is garbage. And then the same person, I'll turn to the next page and there's an article about economics, which I don't know that much about. And I'll be like, I guess Trump's tariffs are really bad for the economy. Right? Like as if I didn't just observe that behind the newspaper article, there's this enormous wealth of knowledge that like the journalist knows nothing about. We've just seen the Oscars this past weekend, I guess, when we were recording fairly recently. And mercifully, they seem to have told the winners to keep their speeches short and not pronounce on politics. But near the end there, as the night wore on and maybe people had a couple drinks or something, you get into these positions where it's like some director steps up and she's made a film about like, Bolivian totalitarianism. I'm kind of making this up, but it's roughly what's going on. And she'll say, and of course, it's very relevant to everything that's going on in America today. And everyone nods knowingly. And not one person says, what the actual heck are you talking? Like, be specific. Like, what are you saying? So this is absolutely what you say is absolutely true. And this afflicts scientists, especially because they are often peering into these great mysteries of the physical, the natural world. It's very tempting then to pronounce on first principle questions. What is our purpose? Who created this natural universe? But the great architects of the scientific revolution, Isaac Newton, I'm thinking of especially, but Galileo, actually, this is true of him as well, Copernicus, were all quite explicit that the method they were devising wasn't designed to ask or answer those questions. So built into the scientific method from the beginning, historically, and this is something I describe in detail in the book, when the scientific method comes into being, the way you get it is by closing off certain questions and saying, we're going to come up with a method that can only answer questions of what is, not of what ought or even how or where or whence, right? That these are questions that theology must answer. Science is going to answer these very limited quantitative questions. And so by its very nature, what we call science is this limited area of inquiry. And the best philosophers of science and scientists have always known that it's not designed to answer these other questions, but we do have this authority creep that you're describing that now afflicts us.
The book is fascinating in terms of the journey through history and people's different thoughts of putting more weight on like spirit. Like, do we put more weight on what we read in the Bible or like theology or spiritual matters to explain something? When something conflicts with what people read like very woodenly in the Bible, and even I think and correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of early scientists would have typically been trained in a certain level of theology, because if you went to school back
Oh
in the
yeah.
day, you had a whole body of education. You had like you were maybe just as educated as the average priest or that kind of thing in certain kinds of theological matters, kind of at a base level. I guess the place I'd love to go next is just like let's start with kind of that tension of it seems like people are always trying to discover what is the ultimately what's the mind or cause behind this thing that I'm observing or trying to figure out, and then B, that tension of you know do we lean more into faith or the Bible to explain this, or do we lean into trying to go someplace else? That seems to be a huge tension in the early parts of the book.
Sure. Well, I will go one step further even and say not only are the great scientists through the Middle Ages and up to the scientific revolution, they're all educated theologically, as you say. They all have some form of faith and they are all interested in theological matters. I will also say that they're all motivated by theology. In other words, their reasons for doing science are theological. Galileo, who is often represented as the great intrepid warrior against the church, I think we all had this morality tale in school about how the mean, bad Catholics told nice, rational Galileo that he couldn't do astronomy or something, whatever, however the story goes. I tell that story in the book, and it's very, very different from what you were probably led to believe, in part because Galileo is making a theological argument. He's saying God made nature, God gave me reason, and because God made both things, my reason is designed to understand nature, which is the scientific assumption. And this is something we've lost now. But if you don't believe all of those things, you have no reason to expect science to work. So I want to dwell on this and just break it down a little bit because it's really important. You know, we now think of science and religion as opposed to one another. But if you think about that claim, it's actually self-defeating. Because if you assume that the human brain was just coughed up out of the primordial sludge, right? You take your typical materialist atheist idea about humanity, that we were basically like flopped up onto the shore out of the mud after however many billions of years. And gradually we've been honed into survival machines so that we can pass our genes on. If that's your picture of the world, it makes sense that our minds will be able to work out certain basic things like where do you get water? How do I escape from that lion? Like, how do I stop myself from getting eaten? These are all questions that a primitive evolutionary brain could feasibly work out. There is absolutely no reason why that kind of being, why a purely material evolutionary product should be able to predict the age of a galaxy, however many light years away. That depends upon a much, much larger claim, which is that our minds are not only fashioned to deal with our immediate environment and survivalist surroundings, but are also endowed with certain absolute principles that hold good everywhere and always and actually map across all of time and space. Another way of saying that would be that the human mind is made in the image of the mind that made the universe. That's the same claim. I've just worked my way to it through a kind of philosophical argument rather than a biblical argument. But that biblical idea of the image of God was central to Galileo's arguments, to Newton's arguments, to Copernicus, to everybody basically that expected to be able to chart out the motions of the planets. I mean, Newton, talk about somebody who's interested in theology. Newton wrote volumes, reams upon like the genealogy of Noah and the minutia of the Old Testament. He was, fascinated by scripture. And one reason why was this idea that the mind is a creation of God and so is the universe. And not only that, but the mind is like a blueprint for the universe, or it's like a little key to understanding the way that the world works. And because of that, they were confident that they could resolve certain paradoxes. So like one historical paradox that we don't talk about so much anymore, but that used to be a really big deal is the difference between the outer space and life on Earth. And this was called the superlunary boundary because it was thought that the moon traced out this boundary around the Earth. And above the moon, everything operated according to one set of laws. But below the moon, everything was kind of sin scrambled and messy and weird and operated with different laws. The person who broke the superluminary boundary was Isaac Newton. And that was his big accomplishment. We don't think of it so much. We think about gravity, we talk about the laws of motion, but the point of the laws of motion was these are rules that hold good everywhere. And that was delivering on the promise that guys like Newton thought was in the image of God. That was why they thought they could do that. These days, we have all sorts of other boundaries that we're coming up against. We don't have the superluminary boundary anymore, but we have the boundary between quantum physics and gravity, according to Einsteinian relativity. Those two things don't seem to mesh. We can't seem to find a theory that accounts for both of them in an economical way. And there are other quandaries or paradoxes like this. We are still pressing boldly onward in the assumption that at some point we're going to fix that paradox. They're going to find a way of looking at this so that it makes sense to us. We're going to find rules that we can describe. There's no reason for us to think that that's true unless we are made in the image of God. So even now that we are sort of secularizing, or it seems like we're secularizing, and we make these bold claims on behalf of sort of a secular science, our actions imply that somewhere buried deep we still have those theological assumptions even now, and I think that is a remarkable thing. If there's anything I hope my book gets across, it's to recover that awareness that actually, if we want to believe in science, we also probably have to believe in some kind of Christian theology.
Next, I'd love to have you just comment on the conflict between like church leadership and scientists kind of throughout history. In our modern context, I can think of, people who are pro-evolution versus those who are very wooden on like the first 10 chapters of Genesis with creation and those sorts of
Sure.
things. But I think for a lot of people, if they're not familiar with the kind of exchange throughout history that you go into in the book, they're not aware that there were some pretty dramatic conflicts between people high up in power in church hierarchy and structure, to the point of things not getting published till after people were dead, or all sorts of drama could ensue to the point of prisoner death, depending on what happened, depending on what time of history we're talking about. Tell us a little bit about that drama.
Absolutely. Well, it's important to get this right because there was, as you say, major conflict, sometimes even fatal conflict between different factions, especially in Europe, especially during the time that also includes the Protestant Reformation. I mean, all this stuff is actually interconnected. These different ways of understanding scripture, which lead to different ways of understanding nature, and the sometimes very bloody conflicts between those two things. However, having said all of that, we can very easily fall into this kind of modern version of the story, which kind of comes down to us from the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment has this sort of motivated, almost propaganda idea that what this all amounts to is a conflict between the forces of religion and the forces of reason. There was rational truth, and then there was religious superstition, and these two things began to clash somewhere around the end of the Middle Ages in the academies and in the universities. They continued to be at odds throughout the life of Galileo and certainly Isaac Newton. And then the Enlightenment was supposed to be the bursting forth of light. That is to say, the Middle Ages are now over, and with them, the superstition of the church has been vanquished. Basically, none of that is true. This is all like a French fantasy that we inherit. What is definitely true, though, is that there were major conflicts going on from the jump about how to understand our place in the created universe. And those were mostly religious disputes among Christians and Jews as well. We're arguing over how we should understand our place in the universe. And there were, from the beginning, people who would argue, well, what we know has been handed down in a kind of Aristotelian and scriptural picture. The earth is at the center of the universe, and these are things that we kind of engage with or understand via tradition. And there were people who, also following Aristotle and following the Bible, said, actually, what we need to be doing is always poking holes in this kind of preconceived picture of the world. And this really starts to come to a head, it's true, at the end of the Middle Ages, when guys like Jean Buridan and Nicolas Orem and maybe more obscure figures that we don't talk about so much anymore are starting to ask basically about Aristotle's idea when it comes to projectiles. They're mostly asking about, like, when I shoot an arrow through the air, what happens? And this seems like a very minor dispute, but it is bound up with all of these larger questions. Like, is there a spirit in the arrow that causes the arrow to move? Is there some sort of set of automatic laws that the arrow is following? How does it work? And as guys like Buridan and Orem start to figure out that there are readily predictable, automatic, or spontaneous laws that we can always chart, the role for supernatural intervention starts to seem smaller and smaller. And so sometimes this is referred to as disenchantment or chasing the angels out of the heavens, because you start to lose that picture of the world as superintended at every moment by God. And this very much is a crisis. This is not the same crisis as we usually think of, but it actually does mean that people have to start reconsidering, well, okay, if the angels aren't pushing the planets along, but actually there's a set of laws that governs the planets, well, does that mean that there's no room at all for divine intervention? And Newton starts to kind of worry about this as his laws become more and more comprehensive. But he's constantly at pains to stress that no, this is not in fact an atheistic claim. This shouldn't lead us to atheism, because the laws themselves have to come from somewhere. So up until that point, you really do end up with basically these different ways of interpreting the Bible. And sometimes the church authorities will take one position or another, like they did with Galileo. And that's where you get this idea that the church authorities are on the side of anti-science or something like this. But really, it's two different interpretations of the Bible battling it out. In the wake of Newton, when those laws become so comprehensive that they seem to describe the whole natural world, when Newton has written these laws for describing everything, then you start to get people saying, well, maybe we don't need God at all. And it's really the French Newtonian Pierre-Simon Laplace, who plays a big role in the book, who is rumored to have said to Napoleon, well, I have no need for the God hypothesis. I don't need God to explain anything that's going on. At no point, and this is crucial, at no point did science prove that was true. There was no moment when, quote unquote, science won the fight against, quote unquote, religion. There was a moment, though, when it started to look as if the whole world might be automatic. And really, that's when people started to think, well, what's the need really for God and for the divine? Now, in the wake of that, you get this kind of new modern dispute that we are still kind of living with, which is the dispute between interpreting the Bible literally, as you alluded to, this idea that, like, 7 days in creation must mean 7 24-hour periods, and on the other hand, accepting the scientific account, which seems like our best available evidence points to a much older universe that does have an origin point, but it's way further back in time. Interestingly, that debate can only make sense, only even take shape after the scientific revolution. And so now we sometimes think, well, if you're an Orthodox Christian, then you have to believe in a 7-day creation. And if you're a scientist, you have to believe in not the book of Genesis, but rather in the Big Bang. One of the things that I think my book kind of shows is that before the scientific revolution, it's almost like that choice doesn't make any sense. There are church fathers that interpret the 7 days as more of an allegorical story. There are some that say, yes, it was 7 24-hour days like ours. All of those are faithful interpretations of the Bible. And I would argue you still can actually reconcile a cosmos that seems to have been around for a very long time with what the book of Genesis says. Or even it might be the case at this point that the book of Genesis is actually one of the best possible keys for interpreting some of what we're learning about the origins of the universe. And I've already gone on too long, so I won't get into the nuts and bolts of that, except to say that you should buy the book, and I explain kind of how that might work in the last part of the book. But yeah, this has been a tumultuous conflict for centuries. But what's not true is that you have to pick between like God and science. Actually, what's going on really is always a dispute over how best to understand our place in the universe and what are the tools that we can use. My argument is simply science is a tool that we can use to get facts about our position in the physical world. Religion is the best, as it were, technology we have. And Christianity, I think, is the ideal technology for understanding the meaning, the consequences, and the implications of what we know about our place in the universe.
And if we kind of look through our modern lens of sort of fallout for, we're going to push all spiritual ideas to the side, and we're just, you know, torn down to our small like atoms, or as I've heard you and others say, chemistry in a meat sack or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Like what's the fallout? Like, where do we start to fall into ditches if that's all we are? Like, what are
Yeah.
some of the extremes that people have taken that to in our modern age?
Well, people who are only listening won't be able to see me kind of waving my arms around and saying, just look around you. But yes, I actually think, and I argue in the book, that like most of our modern crises are in some way related to this picture of humanity as a clump of atoms on another hunk of rock, right? The phrase I always like to cite here is Stephen Hawking in an interview once said that we are chemical scum on a moderate sized planet. And you think, man, that guy must have been great at parties. But obviously one of the most brilliant scientists of his generation, um, but can't see what an incomplete and desperately depressing picture of humanity that is. For all the reasons I've already suggested, I think it's also an incorrect and false picture of humanity. But you're asking, like, what happens if you think that? Well, I mean, you look at the sort of plummeting birth rates around the world. I think you see how that affliction seems to be spreading from country to country. It doesn't seem to have a political ideology. It doesn't seem to be yoked to any particular nationality. Well, what's one thing that the whole world basically has in common now? All of the world has in some way been touched by the era of materialism that we have just lived through for 500 years. And if you think that we are a clump of atoms that sort of collects and then dissipates, what purpose is there really to going through all the trouble of perpetuating the species? People have children when they believe that life has meaning. When they don't believe that life has meaning, you end up with people like Les Knight, the founder of the voluntary human extinction movement, who argues that we're a stain upon nature and a drain upon its resources and should simply yeet ourselves into the cosmic void. You get that. You also get the idea that we should be replaced by AI, which is very popular now, right? When you come up with basically a chatbot that can do predictive text a zillion times better than your iPhone. One response to that would be, hey, cool, I can use this for a news digest every morning. The other response to it would be, this is going to destroy us all and turn us into paper clips. And the choice between those two responses is not actually a scientific choice. It's about what you believe about our humanity and how indispensable or valuable our humanity might be. If our humanity is just one among a number of accidents that has happened in the course of history, well, then here's the next evolutionary stage. It's a machine that's going to churn us up into mincemeat and dispense with us. On the other hand, if you think that humanity is the capstone of a created universe, you might not be so worried about that, and you might not be so inclined to give over your birthright of existence to a clump to a hunk of metal that churns out words. These are just like some of the current problems that we're facing. Why should we exist? Where should we go from here? What should we be able to do with our bodies? Should we be able to hack them up into pieces at will and rearrange them based on our immediate whims, or do they have a certain inherent intrinsic logic and order and form to them? Right? These are all things that right now you are seeing people making all kinds of bananas arguments that we know are wrong about how humanity is over, how we should give ourselves up, but we can't say why they're wrong unless we get over this, I think, now declining ideology, which presents us as merely, as you said, chemistry sets and meat sacks.
I think this is part of a bigger problem, especially that we've seen uh, to an extreme maybe over the previous 4 years, but just this idea that your family of origin is terrible, the faith of your family is
Totally.
terrible, your country is awful, and just to the point where, again, if all you are left with is I'm a pile of atoms or I'm a chemistry set in a meat sack, that this isn't a story worth writing yourself into. And I mean that's the whole beauty of a faith journey is you're right you're a part of this story that's been ongoing since the beginning of time, and you know where you come from, you know where you are in present, kind of what you are on mission, so to speak, and you also have an idea of the future. If you strip all that away, it's no wonder that people just go into all these crazy and bizarre excesses.
100%. And this stuff takes a couple generations, which is one reason why it's not been apparent until very recently. I mentioned before, it's like, why are birth rates plummeting around the world, and why are they plummeting now? If my argument is true, and if this all got started with a bunch of French guys in the 1700s and 1800s, why is it only now that we're living through what seems to be a genuine crisis of purpose and meaning um, in the developed world, but also more generally? And the answer to that is it takes a very, very long time to dismantle received opinion. Um, this is something that Friedrich Nietzsche kind of got spot on. I don't cite Nietzsche approvingly in a lot of contexts, but in this one area, this is why he was a nihilist before everybody else was a nihilist, or why he saw nihilism coming before everybody else did, is because he realized once you take away the buttress of the supernatural, once you pull out that plank, you're going to hang in the air like Wile E. Coyote for a couple generations. Like for a while, people will still think there's a reason to have kids and to be virtuous and to choose like goodness and truth and beauty and to think that those things are real. But after a while, people are going to start turning around and say, wait, why do we believe in those things actually, after all, if all we are is a cosmic void? And if you really want to see this stuff happening in real time, just go on Reddit. Just scroll r/shower thoughts or r/atheism or whatever, and you see people like gradually wrestling with the implications of what we've been saying we believe as a society for a long time now. And a lot of it is really dark. A lot of it is, why should I go on existing? Why should I, want the world to proceed in any kind of virtuous or happy or friendly way? And I actually really think that we are uh, really hitting rock bottom with this stuff now. I mean, I say that advisedly because it can always get worse. That's one of the eternal pieces of
There's
good
a
news.
deeper hole to fall into somewhere.
There's always a deep, yeah, exactly. It can always get worse. Um, but I actually have felt in the past few decades, or I guess, less than that, in the past decade, I felt a shift in the weather on this very subject. And even just down to the point of when I started writing this book, I would have said, this is a book about materialism and why it's wrong. What is materialism and why is it wrong? That's 3-ish years ago now that I started writing the book in that DMV. Now, looking at the atmosphere into which the book has emerged and looking around me and seeing the other books that are coming out around this time, like Ross Douthat's Believe or All Things Are Full of Gods by David Bentley Hart, I'm starting to think that actually my book is what was materialism and why was it wrong? Because this stuff is like really reaching its natural conclusions in the deaths of despair and in the plummeting birth rates and in even I think to some extent in the outbreak of more and more wars around the world. Um, and people are seeing the wages of materialism and they don't like them. And on top of that, the most recent developments in science really call the materialist picture into question, especially as I describe in the book, especially quantum physics. But a lot of things have kind of raised question marks over the idea that we are just atoms in a void. And so the combination of the intellectual transformation, where this no longer seems like the most plausible picture, and the kind of political and emotional and cultural problems that we've been talking about just now, I really think you're starting to see people reaching out for something more, for a bigger explanation of our purpose, which can have dangers of its own if people end up with the wrong answers to those questions. But at least they're asking them in a big way for the first time in my life, I would say.
Yeah, and I think the thing we always have to be conscious of is it's taken many decades for these problems to develop and some of these ideas to run their course. And that course correction, that antidote is also probably going to take years, if not multiple decades to, the pendulum always swings to an extreme and then it's a
Yeah.
slow road going back in the other direction. So, books like yours and others that are speaking to the space, important to have these conversations right now, but this isn't something that's going to be fixed overnight. I'm encouraged by some of the like highly influential podcasters I see, Joe Rogan and others who are actually having faith conversations now and
I
bringing
know.
on
Yeah.
legit theologians to have discussions, which is something I don't think we would have even seen a year ago. So clearly there's a cultural demand for some of these conversations, which is pretty exciting. I think the place I'd like to land, because we're almost on time, in terms of like the light at the end of the tunnel, kind of that move back towards, hey, maybe there is a spiritual kind of component behind what we're studying in science. Like what, how would you have bring us together, kind of land us on what's that hope that you bring us in the book that it's okay to have these spiritual kind of conversations in this scientific context, if you will.
Well, you really put your finger on it with this very public revival that I think we're looking at, or maybe just the stirrings of a potential revival. Um, if something can't go on forever, it won't go on forever. And the picture of the world that we started to accept after the Newtonian revolution, and it started that I grew up with, the picture of the world that I grew up with in that those high school years when I was living under the shadow of the new atheists. The picture of the world as a machine. It doesn't need any spiritual input to function, that just runs without mindlessly forever, without any kind of any kind of soul or transcendent reality, and certainly with no God. That picture is an anomaly in human history. If you pull back the camera, it's something that people have only believed for a very, very short span of time. It's incoherent philosophically. It is now being dismantled scientifically, and it's deadening spiritually and culturally and emotionally. And as exactly as you say, it took about 500 years for the implications of that materialism to work themselves out. Um, and we are only 100 years into what I think of as the real turning point in scientific history, the quantum revolution. We're about 125 years in now, which is also a very short amount of time. And these buds that we're starting to see spring up now, people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali making very public conversions, or guys like Joe Rogan having faith conversations on these massive podcasts, successful books coming out to make the case for not just that it's possible to be religious, but that religion is the most rational and desirable point of view. This is now you're just starting to see the knock-on effects of a world historical transformation, and it's exciting to be living through it. It's a big responsibility to be living through it, but it also means that we might just be at the beginning of a far brighter era in human history.
And you stole kind of what would have been an answer to my like last question, so I'll go a slightly different direction, which is fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Like books to read after your book. Somebody reads Light of the Mind, Light of the World. Like, what should they read next as a follow up?
Well, there's one book that if you're able to dance with me through the history of science, then you will probably also be able and willing and excited to read a book by Owen Barfield called Saving the Appearances. Owen Barfield was a dear friend of C.S. Lewis and one of the kind of lesser known inklings. So he hung out with Tolkien and all those guys. And that is the book that I think is most prescient. It's much. I think it's from the 60s or maybe the 70s. But he sees all of this stuff coming, and he really beautifully lays out why materialism isn't adequate. Um, and then if you're into more contemporary books, I already mentioned a couple titles: All Things Are Full of Gods by David Bentley Hart, Believe by Ross Douthat, Living in Wonder by Rod Dreher. Uh, my dad's books, the Great Good Thing and The Truth and Beauty. There's actually, it's a really good time to be reading about this stuff these days. But if there's one that you haven't heard of, that's from the archives, I would say, yeah, read some Owen Barfield, read Saving the Appearances, or read Worlds Apart.
And Spencer, in terms of people connecting with you, finding out more about this book, all the things that you have going on, where do we best discover you on the web?
Easiest place is Substack, and the website is rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Hopefully, a pretty easy URL for Christians to remember. And that's where I post regular essays and news, and you can connect with me there.
And we'll make it easy like we do with every episode. We'll have links in the description and the show notes to websites mentioned, books mentioned, as well as links to where you can pick up your very own copy of Spencer's new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Spencer Klavan. Once again, our book today was Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith. And Spencer, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you back in the show.
Likewise, Shaun, the honor was all mine. Thanks very much.